So we are in the story of David and Goliath. Let's just say out of the gate, we love a good underdog story. We love that the slow and steady tortoise beats the arrogant, I've got time to take a nap during the race hare, right? We love these stories. We love that Merlin swims the ocean and rides on sea turtles and makes his way and actually finds Nemo in the end. We love that Rocky goes into the heart of the Soviet Union and beats Drago in his own territory. In the last round, we love that the Karate Kid wins the tournament when all the odds are against him. We love that Utah beats Alabama in the 2009 Sugar Bowl when they should not have had a chance. We love these underdog stories, don't we, Van Morrow? Amen? Underdog stories. I'm sorry I got personal there. Today's text is easily one of the top three most favorite Bible stories of all time. If you were to ask Levi and probably any other kid around his age about their favorite Bible story, then David and Goliath would be on the short list for sure. It is a story of faith and courage and victory against all odds. It is one of the most well-known underdog stories in human history, not just in the world of Bible and church, but in all of human history. The David and Goliath story is a very well-known underdog story. As a matter of fact, you can do a quick Google search and pull up 1 million images about David and Goliath that will look a lot of different ways, right? Kind of the old classic. We'll just flip through these to give you some ideas. There's kind of the cartoon Goliath with his giant shield by his side. There is that David and Goliath, who looks like he's off, I don't know, Disney Channel. Or cartoon David and Goliath. Just so many images on the internet of David and Goliath. So many portrayals of this giant fighting this shepherd boy. So again and again, tons of images online about David and Goliath and the portrayal of this story. The names David and Goliath have become synonymous with underdog victories. Like, you don't have to be a church person to know the story of David, the shepherd boy turned giant slayer who bravely faced and conquered an angry giant with a sling and a rock while everyone else cowered in fear. It is the quintessential underdog story. Like, David is the Rocky Balboa of the Bible. He is the Rudy of Scriptures. He's the William Wallace of the Bible. Like, we want to be like David. We want to be filled with courage and faith and save the day and save the people. We love stories of underdogs who are turned into heroes. And here's our tendency with this story. Our tendency is to make this story about facing our own giants, our own fears, our own doubts, our own relationship struggles, our own debts, our own internal demons. And you'll often hear, like, be brave and be courageous like David. The bigger they come, the harder they fall. I've even heard stories and sermons preached of the 5 stones and how you can use those 5 stones as different tools to equip us to face our giants, that we can muster courage to face the giants in our life. A famous writer and historian and podcaster named Malcolm Gladwell even wrote a little book called David and Goliath, and the subheading of the book is Underdogs, Misfits, and the Art of Battling Giants. It's actually a pretty fascinating little read. In the book, he gives stories, and here's his theme of the book, stories of how weaknesses are actually our greatest strengths. You see, most of the time, these stories make the story of David and Goliath about us. That you just need God on your side to face your giants. And the hero becomes David. The hero becomes us. It places us at the center of the story to be like David. But here's the problem, and here's real life. What happens when the giants win? What happens when the struggle is real, when we do not have the faith and the courage of David? What happens when I lose the battle again and again and again? The reality is that can be crippling. It can be crippling in our own lives and in our spiritual lives. Here at City Church, we say this regularly. It really comes back to how we view the Scriptures, how we read and understand the purpose of the Bible when we do this. You see, there's kind of 2 primary ways to interpret the Bible. There's to interpret the Bible as if it is my story, or to interpret it as if it is his story. My story says the Bible is a roadmap that teaches me basically how to navigate life, that the Bible is about me. His story reminds me that it is the story of God. The story of God pursuing rebellious people. The story of redemption. It is a story about God's glory. And that the story of the Bible is not so much about what I do, but it is about what He has done for me. You see, the Bible does provide direction for living, but it is always within the context of what God has done on our behalf. That the life direction that the Scriptures provide is always based on the foundation of who God is and what God has done in Jesus. It is the story of the gospel. It's not a story of how good I am or how brave I am or courageous I am. It is a story about a God who has provided everything necessary. So what is the story of David and Goliath about? Well, let's talk about it. Let's set the stage first. We'll go back and read the beginning of 1 Samuel chapter 17 so we can kind of understand what's going on in the text. You know the story. We'll reread it. The Philistines gathered their armies for battle. They were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah. They encamped between Soko and Zikah in Ephes Damin. So this is this valley that exists between these two hillsides. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. So think in ancient times, kind of old school. It even comes up to like Civil War times where battles would basically just be line up, nose to nose, chest to chest, and just fight it out. And the last army standing wins. They were bloody. They were gruesome. Even in American history, that's how our initial battles were fought. And so think in those terms that they're battling, lining up to battle against each other. But this time it's going to look a little different. The Philistines stood on the mountain on one side. Israel stood on the mountain on the other side with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. According to kind of how you break down historic measurements, there's all kinds of opinion on this. Goliath can be as tall as 9 feet tall, or he can be as high as 7 feet tall, kind of how you break down the dimensions. Either way, he's a big dude, okay? So there's been a lot of hype. I know a lot of you don't follow NBA basketball, but the NBA draft was this past week or so, and there's been a lot of hype because there's this player that's 7 feet. I think he's like 7'5" or 7'6" or something. Really tall, lanky guy that's like the premier draft player in the draft for a long time. And so think in those terms. Think like over 7 feet, possibly all the way up to 9 feet. And so this giant walks out. 5, he had a helmet of bronze on his head. He was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. Again, according to how you do Old Testament measurements, this is somewhere 150 to 200 pounds. And he had bronze armor on his legs, a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spearhead weighed 600 shekels of iron. And the shield bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? Are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then he will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistine said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." And when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So we're familiar with this scene. The battle lines are drawn. Philistines, Israelites, who are the most formidable enemy of the Israelites. And the Philistines simply send out their champion, Goliath, this massive, strong warrior that the text later says has been trained as a warrior from childhood, all the way up 7, 8, 9 feet tall, and wears weights like a jacket, right? 150, 200 pounds, wearing it like a jacket. He's defiant. He is terrifying. And he proposes this contest of champions, this winner takes all approach. And the Israelites cower in fear. Now, let's say here in this moment, because it'll be important later in the text, they have a king whose name is Saul, who the scripture said was actually head and shoulders above most of the men in all of Israel. He was chosen to be the leader. If you've been here for a few weeks of the David series, you know that this idea of electing a king was the idea of electing a warrior, someone that would lead the troops into battle. That's Israel's king. And Saul, who should have been the one to step up, cowers in fear. Their leader withdraws, pulls back in fear. Well, we know the story. Twice a day for 40 days, the giant steps forth and challenges the Israelites. So at least 80 times he challenges them. 80 times he taunts them. 80 times he curses their God. 80 times the Israelites wait for their king to intervene. 80 times they are reminded of their own cowardice as this man steps forth and challenges them again and again. Meanwhile, David, who's on sabbatical from the palace, if you've been here the last few weeks, he's back to the fields, tending the sheep while the war is going on. Saul would have been with the army. And so David is sent by his father to bring sandwiches basically to his brothers in the army. The original Jesse's Deli, right? Take these sandwiches to your brothers on the front lines. And as he arrives, David witnesses the fear and the impact of Goliath's taunts on the soldiers. And David's heart is stirred within him. Verse 26, the scriptures say that David said to the men who stood by him, "What shall be done for the man who kills the Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" David is angry. He responds different than the other soldiers. How dare this guy defy our God? You see, David knows and trusts God's power, and he wants to fight this blasphemer. He knows that God is on his side. Well, David's suggestion does not go over well with the others in the army, even his brothers. His brothers are skeptical. They are angry. They basically say to David, go back to the field, dude. Go tend the sheep. This is not your role. You shouldn't even be here. They're angry at their own brother, but David is persistent. I'll fight him. And eventually, word of David's valor reaches King Saul, who again would know David. He calls David into his presence, and he says this, 31, when the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." Saul says, "You are not equipped to fight this giant. You're a youth, a young man. Goliath has been trained as a gladiator from his youth." Well, David is steadfast in his conviction. He tells Saul how God delivered him from the paw of the lion and the bear while tending his father's sheep. He believes this same God who had protected him in those situations will also give him victory over Goliath. 34, David says to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." And David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Very important here. David is courageous, not because of his own abilities. David doesn't say, "Look, Saul, I've been waiting for this moment. I'm an expert stone thrower. You should see me. I can split hairs. I can knock down 5 consecutive bottles at 50 yards. Now, don't make a mistake here. David is an expert stone thrower. That was part of the types of warriors that would be in an army in that day and age, were people that could throw stones and kill people with stones. So David is more than likely trained in this regard, but that's not what he is relying upon. David is not courageous because of his own abilities. David is courageous because he knows God is infinitely more powerful than Goliath. David walks by faith. His courage here does not make sense otherwise. He has to know where his strength comes from. It makes no sense for David to look at Goliath and say, well, I can take this guy. Man, you should see how I can throw a stone. That makes no sense. It makes no sense for David to think that his weapons compare to Goliath's weapons. It would be like if your pastor said, look, I'm a fairly athletic guy. The older I get, less athletic I am, but I think I can take a professional MMA fighter. Let's just like put me in the octagon. I'm ready to go. Let's just fight. Let's make it happen. I'm fully confident that I can take down and defeat an MMA fighter. You'd look at me and be like, Devin, come on. One, you're not that athletic. Two, you're never going to beat an MMA fighter. They are trained warriors. They are trained fighters. They give their life training and preparing and doing cardio and learning how to fight and kick and reverse things and to grapple and all the things necessary to be a successful MMA fighter. Devin, you would not stand a chance, right? And that would be a natural response and a reasonable response. David does not think he can take down Goliath because of his own abilities. It does not make sense. David believes he is infinitely more powerful than Goliath, not because of David's skills, but because the Lord has delivered him and will deliver him again. So 38, Saul clothes David in his armor. He puts a helmet of bronze on his head, clothes him with his own coat of mail, and David strapped his sword over his armor, and he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. David says to Saul, I cannot go with these. I have not tested them. So David put them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. I don't have time to dig into it, but I love the image here that David kneels down at the brook, and most likely in full sight of the opposing armies and potentially of Goliath himself. And there's David, vulnerable, kneeling at a brook, choosing 5 stones, preparing his heart and soul for the battle he's about to face. But Saul reluctantly agrees for David to confront Goliath. He offers him his own armor. David refuses, and instead he arms himself with the slingshot that he has and 5 smooth stones from a nearby brook. Again, David's weapons speak of his faith in God. He is going to war against a trained gladiator with a slingshot, but not just a slingshot. An unwavering faith and trust in God. And with that, David steps onto the battlefield to face this enormous opponent. And Goliath is ticked, isn't he? Like, he is insulted. He can't believe that this young man, this teenager, stands before him. 41, the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him. This word has to do with disgust and anger. He's a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? Like, he doesn't even see the sling in David's hand. He just sees the staff. Am I a dog that you come to me with a stick? And the Philistine cursed David by his God. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. In their world, with what's happening, it makes sense for Goliath to be offended. How dare would you send a child out to me? I'm a trained warrior. He feels disrespected, angry, and he rightfully talks trash, right? I'm going to feed you to the birds of the air. David's response are probably the key words in this entire story and text. David is unafraid. And the reason he is unafraid, verse 45, David said to the Philistine, You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. 45, David says, look, God's honor is at stake. Goliath, you have defied the God that I serve. God's honor is at stake. David knows the stories. God delivering the Israelites out of Egypt, God parting seas, God preserving his people. David lived in the tradition of a God who was faithful, a God who was loving, a God who was a covenant-keeping God. That's the tradition that David grew up in. And so for Goliath to stand and to defy this God that David trusted and believed in and put his faith in and had delivered David and was faithful to David, this God's honor was at stake in David's mind. 46, again, this day. Like David just goes right to the point, doesn't he? Like this day, today, Goliath, today, this day, the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And his words make us want to, grunt or something, right? Like, argh. You need to get a grunt out right now based on the words of David. Let's go ahead. Go ahead, men. I'll let you give space for a grunt right now. Ready? 1, 2, 3. It's obvious none of us are ready to face Goliath. David says, look, God will deliver me. God will win this battle. God will deliver David for the purpose of promoting his own glory, God's glory. Not so that David might get the credit, but God will deliver him so that God might be glorified, so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Not so that David's name will be known, David will be recognized, that he'll win the gold belt. None of those things. David says God will win so that God's name will go forward, so that he will be glorified. 47. That all this assembly, all these cowards hiding in their tents, all these people afraid to step into the battlefield, so that all these people who have listened time and time again, 80 times, Goliath to come out and defy them and mock them and make fun of them and curse their gods, so that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with a sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. David says it is God's battle, and he is not limited to human abilities. God fights his battles in his own power. And David is simply the instrument that God will use to display his own power. See, this whole episode is not about David. It is about David's God. David trusts God completely because God is completely trustworthy. David trusts God completely because David's God is completely trustworthy. He is the source of David's courage. He is the source of David's strength. He is the source of David's fearlessness. God can be trusted. And that's exactly what happens. 48, the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David. David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. It would have been very common in ancient times for the head to kind of serve as a trophy of victory. And so it would have been common for David to cut the head off of his enemy and to kind of hold that head up to show the defeat has taken place. And then he'll actually take this head and kind of parade it around like this is what God can do. And again, we kind of want to grunt, right? Sounds like kind of manly what's going on, a warrior taking place. And so God fights for his people. You see, the victory has already been won because of the God that David serves. And that gives David the courage to, I like the text here, run quickly toward Goliath, making this an unfair fight. Not for David, but for Goliath. An unfair fight. Because Goliath's not fighting David. Goliath is fighting the God of David. And that makes this an unfair fight. So how do we respond to a story like this? So again, what we often hear is be bold and courageous and you can overcome your own personal Goliaths. You can be like David. Is that the point of the David and Goliath story? Well, not exactly. This kind of be like David, moral of the story approach to interpreting this narrative misses the bigger picture within God's redemptive story. I want to be careful here because I believe David does serve as an example to us as someone who trusts the all-powerful God to save his people in an extraordinary way. So he is an example here of someone that trusts God fully and completely. And it challenges us as followers of God to, ask ourselves that question, like, what does it look like to face life's difficulties with the full confidence that God is with us? Like if we were to live everyday life and face the difficulties of life with this perspective that God is with me and God is all powerful, like how that would change kind of our everyday rhythm of life in this world. So David acts in faith, and as an example, like David teaches us to trust God regardless of the difficulties that we face, that the battle we are facing is the Lord's and he is trustworthy, that God can be trusted in life's most difficult circumstances. And David illustrates that truth. While the people of God around him cower in fear, David steps forth in faith, trusting the God who is trustworthy. And so the story of David is an example of what it means to live with that kind of faith. That over and over again in the scriptures, we see that God uses underdogs who trust him completely to overcome those that would be considered strong, who trust in their own abilities. That's the redemptive story. I highlight that a lot here at City Church, that God often uses the undeserving, the weak, to accomplish his purposes and plans. And so David teaches that in this story. But here's what I believe is the key to how we are to draw conclusions or life applications from the story of David. And this is so important about this story. And so I'll just put it in a statement. We do not fight for victory. We fight from victory. We do not fight for victory. We fight from victory. Now let me explain that. The story of David is not just an example for us to follow. The story of David is a picture, it is a shadow, it is a glimpse of what Jesus has done for us. You see, we'll talk about this again and again in our David series. We already have and will continue to do so. You see, Jesus is the greater David. Jesus is greater than David. The story of David is not really ultimately about David. The story of David is ultimately about the God of David and pointing forward to Jesus. You see, to make this story just about David's courage or faith is to miss the bigger picture of the biblical narrative, the redemptive story, the gospel. I mean, think about the storyline within God's bigger story. In the story of David, the Israelites can't face Goliath. They're afraid. They can't face Goliath. What do they need? They need someone who will stand in the gap for them, that will stand in their place before Goliath. Even King Saul, their leader, cowers in fear. You see, someone must fight on behalf of God's people. So what does God do in this story? God raises up this unlikely deliverer, this shepherd from the backside of a field tending sheep. He raises up this unlikely deliverer to save his people. He raises up an unexpected, unknown shepherd boy who trusts God fully. God uses the weaker David to overthrow the more powerful Goliath. You see, David is a picture of how God works. David is, in this moment, Israel's champion. He is their champion rescuer. He is the champion who rescues God's people. He is the one that God uses to rescue the entire nation of Israel from death and destruction and judgment, which is what awaits them if Goliath wins this battle. You see, the fearful and the incapable soldiers and people, they reap the benefits of David's faith and action. They participate in, they get the victory that David won. David represents them. He stands up for them. And hopefully, as I explain it this way, you can kind of get the picture, the bigger redemptive picture of God's story. That God uses David to save Israel from their enemy. But God's ultimate victory does not come in the form of David slaying Goliath. David is a mere shadow of what is to come. See, Jesus is the ultimate champion rescuer. Our ultimate enemy is not our circumstances. Our ultimate enemy is not our financial struggles. Our ultimate enemy is not our relationship difficulties. Our ultimate enemy is not our addictions. Our ultimate enemy is not our sickness or whatever quote unquote giants you are facing. Our ultimate spiritual enemies are a holy law that demands our perfection. 2, our sin that causes us to fall short of God's holy standard, that law. And 3, the consequences of that sin, which is death. That's our ultimate spiritual enemies. Our inability to meet God's perfect demands, the consequences of our sin, which the scripture says is death. And so the gospel is, the good news is that God provides an unlikely rescuer who delivers his people from their ultimate enemies. That Jesus wins the victory on our behalf. You see, if we're being honest here, we are less like David facing the giant, and we are more like the Israelites. The Israelites who are cowering in their tents while the champion rescuer stands in our place and wins the battle over sin, death, and hell for us through his own sacrifice. We like to make ourselves David, but maybe we're better off to make ourselves the Israelites, hiding in the tent and needing someone to stand before the ultimate enemies on our behalf. The ultimate victory occurs when God the Son he dons human flesh and becomes one of us. Our unlikely Redeemer, Savior, is born to a teenage mother in the ghetto and lives a life of service and humility before giving his own life for our sins. He dies our death. He takes our place before being raised from the dead to once and all conquer our ultimate enemies of death, hell, and the grave. You see, here's the gospel in David's story. It is not, this is good news, it is not on you to overcome the giants in your life. Are you hearing me, City Church? It's not on you to overcome the giants in your life. Jesus did that. He's already accomplished that. He has already fought. He has already conquered the real giants for me. Now I am free to rest in what he has done as I face life's difficulties. You see, what gives me the courage to fight against the giants of life, what gives me the courage to face suffering and disappointment and failure and criticism and hate and racism and bad relationships and money problems and depression and guilt and sin and pain and sickness and ultimately death. What gives us the strength to face these difficulties in life is that not that we can somehow muster up the courage to be strong enough. What gives us the courage to fight these giants of life is that Jesus has already fought the battle and won. That I stand in his victory, what has already been accomplished on my behalf. Because here's reality for us as we live life. What happens when I can't face my giants? What happens when I can't bootstrap myself up enough or somehow get it together enough to overcome what's going on in my life? What happens when I am not strong enough to beat Goliath? What happens when the giant wins? What happens when my marriage falls apart? What happens when he or she walks out? What happens when the addiction returns? What happens when I can't control my anger, when I lose my cool, when I can't control my tongue? What happens when I can't forgive? What happens when the cancer comes back? Like, where is my hope when I can't muster the courage to win the battle? And what gives me hope is this: knowing that Jesus already won the victory. He has done everything necessary for me to live in the victory that he has won on my behalf. I mean, we could give so many examples here. That I can face whatever it is going on in my life, not because of how awesome and good and strong and courageous I am, or lack thereof. That I can face whatever is going on in my life because of what he has done. Because of who I am in him. That means that I can face insecurity and self-doubt because my identity is not found in me. My identity is found in Jesus. I am his. That means that I can face addiction because my fulfillment is ultimately not found in me. My fulfillment is found in who I am in Jesus. I can face my fear of failure because I know he will never leave me. He will never forsake me. He will never abandon me. He is with me. I can face my financial insecurities because I know that God is the ultimate provider. He's evidenced it in Jesus, who provided the ultimate sacrifice for me. I can face my hurt and my pain and betrayal because I know that God has forgiven me and that God will equip me and enable me to forgive others. I can face my brokenness. I can face my sin because in Jesus, God has redeemed me. I am his. I am redeemed in him. I can face my bad relationships because God's love has been poured out in my life through Jesus. I can face whatever life throws my way, not because of who I am or how awesome I am, but because of who he is and what he has done on my behalf. So guess what? When I get punched in the mouth again by the giant, when I get beat up and hurt, when I get wounded and I can't seem to face the giant again, hear the good news of the gospel. The victory has been won on your behalf. I can face life's difficulties because I do not fight for victory. The victory has already been won. I fight life's battles from the platform of victory. The battle has already been fought. The battle has already been won. And so I face life's difficulties knowing that what He has done is enough for me. I can rest in what He has done. That's why, hear me, that's why whatever you're facing, whatever you're going through, whatever difficulty you have, whatever, all those things that we've mentioned, whatever hurt and financial insecurities and failures and relationship issues, whatever it is you are facing, it is an unfair fight. It is an unfair fight because whatever happens in this life, Jesus is more than enough. He's already won the victory. He can be trusted. He is the greater David. And so you enter into whatever it is you're battling, whatever it is you're facing, whatever you're struggling, you enter it in as an unfair fight because God is on your side. He is fighting the battle for you. So whatever you face, whatever you fight, whatever difficulty you have, it's an unfair fight because God's on your side. We fight from victory, not for victory. So I end with this. Stop trying to face life's giants with your own abilities. They're not enough. Stop trying to face life's giants with your own abilities and rest in what Jesus has done. He has fought that battle for you. Cling to Him. Rest in Him. I got good news for you, City Church. The giant doesn't win. The giant doesn't win. The giant doesn't win because what? Jesus wins. He's already won. The giant that you're facing in your life does not have the final word. And it's not because you're strong enough and good enough and better than you were yesterday, and now you've got it figured out, and now you've gone through the program, and now you've tried harder. The giant doesn't win because of you, because of something you do. The giant doesn't win because what has already been done on your behalf. And it's why every week at City Church we're going to stand up here and we're going to yell and preach the gospel, because it always comes back to what Jesus has done, what Jesus has done on your behalf. And the gospel is not just about asking Jesus into your heart, the diving board that gets you into the pool, the front door that gets you into the house. The gospel is what you live every single day as you cling to the truth again and again and again. What Jesus has done is enough for me. And whatever I face today, whatever I go through today, whatever life situations come my way, whatever life difficulties come my way, Jesus, help me to remember today, when I face that difficulty, what you have done is enough for me. And it is enough for us. And I will cling to what Jesus has done. It is what Paul says in Romans, that it is the power of the gospel that enables us to live every single day from victory and not for victory. See, if you're trying to figure out for victory, guess what? You're always going to wonder, have I gotten there? Have I made it? Have I accomplished enough? Have I done enough? Have I stopped doing enough? Am I ever going to get the victory? And you will live with a haunting, right? A haunting idea of, have I done enough? But when we cling to what Jesus has done every single day, when we fail, when we feel inadequate, when the addiction wins again, when the giant is on us again, every single day we can be reminded, my victory is not mine. My victory is in Him. It is what He has done. Living the Christian life from the perspective that I am living from victory and not for victory will change your entire perspective of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. So when you don't feel like David, you don't feel bold enough and courageous enough and strong enough, when you would rather be in the tent cowering in fear, guess what? You have a champion rescuer that faces the giant on your behalf, and the battle has already been won. The fight's over. He has conquered death, hell, and the grave, so that you might live in the victory that he won on our behalf. Let's bow our heads for prayer.